Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're going to be in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 34. It's an interesting chapter. We finished the parts of Ezekiel that deal with the judgments. There'll be a little bit left between here and the end of the book, but for the most part, we've already studied the part that deals with judgment. So we're into restoration and promises for the eschatological age and eschatology and the millennial temple, the valley of dry bones, and all the stuff that we've grown to know and love. So let's get right on into it, and we'll be in chapter 34. All right. We've talked almost incessantly about the false shepherds of Judah, or the false prophets, or the leaders, religious leaders, civil leaders, all kinds of leaders. We've been talking about, and we've talked about the shepherds as a metaphor for the leaders of Judah, and their flock being a metaphor for the people of Judah. The shepherds are actually corrupt leaders, not real shepherds in the sense that a shepherd actually cares for their flock. We're now through the judgments, as I already mentioned, and into the restoration portion of the book. The question now becomes, what should be done about the corrupt leaders who led Judah into ruin and judgment? Okay, today would think of a shepherd and a flock as being a religious leader in his church. When we're talking in spiritual terms, we think of the shepherd being the leader of a flock, and the flock being his constituents, the people in his church. A religious leader, I would say, would be somebody like a pastor in today's terms. Then their shepherds were more military and political leaders. They also bore a primary responsibility for the moral and spiritual direction of the nation. For example, the king of Israel, the king of Judah, was called by God into civil service, but also into religious service as a leader who answers to God. A good example would be David. He was chosen by God. He was anointed by the prophet Samuel. He had a responsibility for moral and spiritual leadership of the nation, and that's evidenced by him answering to Nathan when he was confronted with the death of Uriah, which was Bathsheba's husband. So some of the kings were good. Remember, Israel wanted a king so they could be like all the other nations. Well, God gave them what they wanted. And some of the kings, as it turns out, were good. Some of them were really, really bad and even godless. The northern kingdom, I'm not really digressing. I just want to make a point for you. The northern kingdom came about as a result of civil war in the whole house of Israel, and the 10 tribes went to the north to follow a king named Jeroboam, and the other 2 tribes, which was Judah and Benjamin, became the southern kingdom. And as it turns out, there were 10 dynasties. We studied it. We found this out when we studied Hosea. There were 10 dynasties of kings that ruled the northern kingdom, and all of the dynasties were bad. Every one of them. They brought into Israel the apostasy that eventually led to their judgment by God. And there was one dynasty in the southern kingdom, and that was the dynasty of David. And a lot of those kings were bad as well. So I think the main kings that we think of were Solomon, uh, Hezekiah, and Josiah. Those are probably the best kings that we can think of that dealt with Judah. But even Solomon was the one that actually I think he's the one that actually got the apostasy started in the southern kingdom because of his marriages to uh, foreign women who had gods that were not Yahweh. And when he married them, brought them into his palace, he allowed them to bring their worship practices with them rather than just saying, no, you're going to marry me. We're going to do it. We're going to study. We're going to worship Yahweh. He allowed them to bring their gods in, and it filtered into the people eventually. Do we have anything, speaking of the leaders in Israel with the king and so on and so forth, do we have anything like that today? I would have to say no, not really, because we have separation of church and state. We couldn't have our leader of our government also be a leader in the church. No, that's not what I mean. He couldn't be a leader in the government and also be openly well, we have separation of church and state, which really, rather than leading to anything good, it leads to something bad, which is really godlessness. Okay, so we're going to look at chapter 34. There's a figurative message to the shepherds and their sheep. That message for the shepherds is found in verses 1 through 16. The message to the sheep or the flock is found in verses 17 to 24. I think you can find these interesting. There's also, those were figurative messages. There's also a literal message to the people. And we're going to see that in verses 25 to 31. In the figurative message to the shepherds, there is condemnation. There is an announcement of their removal. And there's an announcement that the Lord will take over as shepherd. Now that is very interesting. God will take over as shepherd. We're going to see that in verses 11 through 16. The literal message to the people is the literal message. That's the part found in verses 25 to 31. The literal message to the people is a promise by God to provide them with a covenant of peace. We're going to look back into some other books to see where that has support for what we see in Ezekiel. Okay, so let's get on into it. Verses 1 through 6 deal with condemnation of corrupt shepherds. Let's look at verses 1 and 2. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not the shepherds take care of their flock? Using an examination of the history of the northern kingdom will show that spiritual apostasy of leadership began with Jeroboam. You remember I told you Jeroboam I was the first king of the northern kingdom. We see that in 1 Kings 12, verses 25 to 33, if you want to check that out. He immediately introduces idolatry by erecting 2 golden calves, one in Dan and one in Bethel. That was a big surprise to me. We first saw that when we studied Hosea. And you remember when the Israelites came out of Egypt, what happened? They ended up building a golden calf. I think they even say in these later books that that was the God that actually led them out of Egypt. So this has been a serious God for them over the centuries, and that is that they used the golden calf as in their apostasy against Yahweh. We must read this. Notice he gives credit to the calf as the God who leads them out of Egypt. I think if you look, go back to 1 Kings 12 that I just mentioned, 1 Kings 12 verses 25 to 33. We must take note that these are not stories that don't matter anymore. I want to reiterate that. The Old Testament is an ancient book. The whole Bible is ancient as you get right down to it, but specifically, the Old Testament is ancient. And because it is ancient doesn't mean it is out of touch with society today. If you read through the book of Hosea, and I said this many times as we studied Hosea, it looks like the United States today. And you see what happened to Hosea. I'm not saying that will happen to the United States, but I know that there's great potential for the United States to face judgment because of the way we direct our spiritual lives towards Yahweh or away from Yahweh. There are biblical accounts that are designed to show that Yahweh is sovereign. He is jealous for his people, and he is more than willing to judge his people to draw them back to him. That is a very important statement to understand. He is more than willing to judge his people to draw them back to him. That means they followed Yahweh at one time and they drifted away. And almost, if you look into Hosea and Ezekiel, they weren't drifting away, they were running away. They got into this very deep spiritual apostasy, and God wants to draw them back. And that's what the judgment was, that these judgments, it's more than just a punishment for them ignoring God and combining worship practices of Baal with Yahweh. It's more than the judgment for that. It is a discipline, more in the sense of what we see in Hebrews, where God said, where we read that those he loves, his children, those he loves, he will chasten. This is a chastening. This is the chastening for the Christian is a disciplinary action, hoping to help him understand where he is apart from God, where his sin lies in the worship of Yahweh, and get him to change his ways and come back. The same was true with Israel. He sent them into captivity with Babylon, or with Assyria, as they were dispersed among the nations. But the idea was not to leave them forever, but it was to draw them back to him. So that's what we're looking at. The northern kingdom was destroyed in 722, and we saw in the parable of the two sisters that the younger did not learn from the older. The younger in that story, or in that parable, was Judah. She got to see the way her big sister lived, which was Ephraim, and she didn't learn from it. It actually says that the younger sister turned out to be worse than the older sister. So even though Hosea gives the record of the northern kingdom going into captivity under Assyria, doesn't mean that they were worse. It actually is reported in here in Ezekiel that they were not as bad, that the southern kingdom was worse. Okay, Josiah was killed in battle, and Judah fell into the hands of Josiah was killed in battle, and Judah fell into the hands of a more irresponsible leader. Here is the indictment of the shepherds here in verse 2, verses 2 through 5. So let me read those. Now here's the indictment of the shepherds in verse 3 through 5. So let me read those. He's speaking of Now he's speaking of the shepherds. He says, you eat curds, clothe yourself with wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. Then in verse 5, so they were scattered because, here it is, so they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. Okay, so from verse 2 on, the shepherds only took care of themselves rather than the flock. You know, we think of a shepherd watching after the flock. Well, in this case, in this metaphor, these shepherds took care of themselves rather than the flock. In verse 3, it says they took care of themselves. They slaughtered the choice animals, meaning that they needed special care, the helpless members of society, and were met with cruelty rather than care. In verse 4, the people were scattered with no shepherds, with no moral leadership, moral or spiritual leadership. They had no shepherd, so they wandered aimlessly into idolatry, and they did so immediately. Okay, in verse 5 and 6, notice also that in verse 4, they did not bring back the stray sheep or search for the lost. They said, who cares about the one that is lost? I still got 99. You know, we've heard this parable that Jesus told. Remember from Matthew, the lost sheep, Jesus left the 99 to get the one that was lost. And there's two ways to look at that parable. One is that the 99 are lost and like it that way, and the one wants to be found, or the 99 are not lost and the one needs to be found. But here they said they like it that way. It is the one, it is with the 99. They like the way it is with the 99. We can get along without the one. So again, they're not really interested in those that need the care, the one that got away, the one that's lost. We only care really about what's going on with us right now. They were bad shepherds. All right, let's look at verses 7 through 9. Because of all the bad stuff they did, we're looking at here. Look at 7 through 9. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. It's pretty clear what that's talking about. The NIV calls this their sinful self-interest. They're only concerned about themselves. What happens to the flock is of no concern to them. And in verse 10, this is what the sovereign Lord says: I'm against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherd, now let's hear that, I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. God says, I will do that. I will remove them. I will rescue my flock. God will give personal attention to his flock. He will hold the shepherds accountable. He will remove them, and he will feed his flock. Our verses 11 through 16. This is an announcement of the Lord as shepherd. Now, this is very interesting to think about. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself before I read that, listen for all of the things that bad shepherds did not do, and the things that the Lord will do as shepherd. He covered all of the neglect of the flock by the bad shepherds. Listen for all the promises given in first person where he says, I. Listen for the types of shepherds like as we might think of in Psalm 23. So let me read verses 11 through 16. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them as a shepherd. Now, I myself, this is God speaking. I want you to think about that. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks for his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they are scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. They were lost in idolatry and immorality, and they were physically scattered as well. He says he will rescue them from where they were scattered. This is more than just Judah that we're talking about, who is scattered by Babylon in the sense that they were taken from their homeland into captivity, but they were kept intact and eventually allowed to return to Israel after 70 years. But the scattering of the northern kingdom by Assyria is another story. They were scattered into the nations and assimilated into the nations. The scattering was so thorough and complete as to the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom was called the lost tribes. For the most part, these are the tribes God will go after and shepherd. Now, we also need to think forward to the New Testament. After Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, everybody was scattered. So there's another scattering that we're going to have to consider other than what happened here in the Old Testament. And when I say consider it, because there are promises that we're going to be looking at where Israel is brought back. And it's from all of these scatterings that they're going to be brought back from. Okay, verse 13 is the big verse. Let's look at 13. 13 says, I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines and in the settlements in the land. So that's a big verse. I will bring them out of the nations where they were scattered into captivity. I just mentioned that a little bit when I was talking about there at the end of verse 12. But where will he bring them to when he brings them back? I will bring them back to their own land. That's Israel. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel. So let's look at verse 14. Verse 14 says, I will tend them in good pastures, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I will tend them in Israel. I love that word. I will tend them in Israel. They will lie down on the mountains of Israel. Then in verse 15 it says, I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. He said personal involvement as shepherd. I I will tend, I will bind up, I will shepherd. I got a big wow on that one. What kind of encouragement is this? They will have a real shepherd to count on. They couldn't count on the shepherds of the other uh, day when they had all the false prophets going on, all the apostasy and all that. They really couldn't, and all the cruelty and dishonesty and corruption that was going on in the leadership. They couldn't count on them as shepherds. They have a promise from Yahweh that He will be their shepherd. They are in captivity, and they have God's solemn promise, not just to bring them out of captivity, but to bring them back to Israel. That's a big deal for them. It's all about the land with Israel. It was promised to Abraham. They know that, and they're getting a reiteration of that promise right here. These are eschatological promises. We know that they will happen. It just hasn't happened yet. Okay, verses 17 to 24. It's a determination to judge and deliver. Okay, verses 17 to 19. I'm saying, whoops. Let's see here. He is through talking to the shepherds, and now he will talk to the flock. You can hear the change in what is coming by the change of tone in his voice. He says, as for you, my flock. Let's look at 17 to 19. As for you, my flock. He's switching from shepherd now to addressing the flock. As for you now, my flock. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, and between rams and goats. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you also trample the rest of your pasture with your feet? Is it not enough for you to drink clear water? Must you also muddy the rest of with your feet? And verse 19 says, must my flock feed on what you have trampled and drink what you have muddied with your feet? Here we're talking about members of the flock. That sounds like something we'd hear about the shepherds, but we get to another level here with the members of the flock where we've got the upper elite, upper echelon of the flock. They're serving themselves first as well. And what they're leaving behind for the other remainder of the flock is the dregs. It's the what do you talk about, the muddied water and the trampled feed. He said, here we're talking with members of the flock who take advantage of the members of the weaker members, those who have all they want to feed from the pasture and then trample what is left, and those who drink all the water that they want from the stream, and in so doing they just muddy it up for those that are coming in behind them to have to drink muddy water. God doesn't like it. He's calling them out on that right here. Verses 20 to 22 is now more of the same. The fat advantaged sheep versus the lean, less advantaged or disadvantaged sheep. Let me read verses 20 to 22. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep, because you shove the flank and shoulder, butting all the weak sheep with your horns until you have driven them away. I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between the sheep, between one sheep and another. It's now more the same. The fat advantaged sheep versus the lean, less advantaged sheep. It's bringing the disadvantages out of the way, bringing the disadvantaged out of the way. They're nudging them out of the way. I think with their flank and their shoulder, it says. He says, I'm going to judge you for that. Okay, I love this. Let's look at verses 23 to 24. These are big. 23 to 24 says this. Listen to this as I read. I will place over them. Now, I have a video about this. It's very limited. I'm going to do another video at some time in the not too distant future about this very thing. He says, I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David. Where is David? David's dead and in the grave. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their guide, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will save my flock. I will place over them one shepherd. He will be David, who will tend them. I will be their God. I, the Lord, have spoken. David, he used a couple of times there in repetition. Will he be the one from the lineage of David? It says David. The Sunday school answer is from the lineage of David. That's not what it says. It says David. 2 Samuel 7:16 says God will establish the everlasting throne of David. And here it says David. It won't be. It doesn't say a descendant of David. It doesn't say Jesus. It doesn't say the Messiah. Now Jesus was a descendant, I suppose, but we're going to have to go on and further and see what we're talking about here. It represents the future resurrection of the golden age and the messianic age of Israel. We've talked about that. There's going to be resurrections before the tribulation, great tribulation. Resurrections of believers. There's going to be other resurrections. And David is going to be resurrected. He will be resurrected to be king over the whole house of Israel. Now that is interesting because he says, I will replace over them one shepherd. Well, we had two kingdoms. We had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. We talked about the scattering. They're going to be brought back to Israel. They're going to be consolidated again. They're going to be unified again, and they're going to have one king, and it will be David. Jesus will be King of Kings. He is King of Kings. He will be King of Kings. He will be King of all kings after the second coming. He will be King of the world, so to speak. David will be King of Israel, answering to the King of the world. Okay, verse 24 said, what I really like about that is that it says he will be a prince among them. We have Israel, and he's going to be the prince will be coming out of them, and that one coming out will be David. And when does this occur? It occurs after the second coming, during the 1,000-year reign. The prince will be among them, as will Jesus, the King of Kings. So David is going to be resurrected. Jesus is returning. They will both be there among the people. All right, verses 25 to 31 is a promise of a covenant of peace. Let's look at that. Verse 25 says this. I will make a covenant of peace with them and rid the land of savage beasts so that they may live in the wilderness and sleep in the forest in safety. Ezekiel tells the message of a new covenant of peace. This is the same as what Jeremiah calls the new covenant. Let's look at Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. Listen as I read this. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. With the people of Israel, that's the northern kingdom, and with the people of Judah, that's the southern kingdom. A covenant of peace, one covenant of peace, and that's for the whole house of Israel. So they've got to be brought back together some way or another. God knows how to do it, even though they're the lost tribes, referred to as the lost tribes. They're not really lost because God knows where they are. He's going to bring them back. It will be not like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant. Though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. Verse 33 and 34. This is the covenant. This is the covenant. It wasn't that covenant. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. The law will be in their minds and in their hearts. It's not the Torah. It's God's law. It's the law that they're going to be living by after the second coming. They're just going to know how to worship the Lord. They're going to know what he expects. And I will be their God, and they will be my people. Using Ezekiel's term of peace, we should remember that what man lost in the original sin was peace. He lost that peace with God that God gave him at creation. He lost reconciliation with God. He's going to have a new covenant of peace in the millennial age. In spite of Israel's disobedience, in spite of their unrepentant hearts, he promises a new covenant of peace. At that time, they will be changed. The law will be in the hearts and their minds. They will know God, not just know about God. We're talking about, when we talk about Isaiah 1, I haven't mentioned that in a long time, but God really told the people everything they were doing in relation to worship of him. He didn't like it. He didn't want it. He said, if you go back and read that, he said, when you come into my courts, it's like you're trampling them down. He said, I don't need any more uplifted hand. That's nothing. Anybody can lift their hand. He says, what I want is in your heart. He said, I don't want any more burnt offerings. It's rote practice that you do. It's not done because you love me. What he was saying was, what I want is relationship with you. That's what he's saying they're going to have with this new covenant of peace. The law is going to be in their hearts and their minds. They're going to know God, not just know who he is, know what he is, or know about him. They're going to know him. They're going to love him. They're going to have a relationship with him, as we will as well. They will know God and not just know about him. Their sins will be forgiven forever. This will come in the Messianic age with restoration of the ideal life as was intended in Eden. So we go back to Eden-like conditions. All right, let's look at verse 26. I will make them and the places surrounding my hill a blessing. I will send down showers in season. There will be showers of blessing. Verse 26 begins with I will bless them, which begins a list of benefits of the covenant of peace. Well, I read 26. Let me go back to 27 and read through 31. Verse 27. The trees will yield their fruit, and the ground will yield its crops. The people will be secure in their land. They will know that I am the Lord when I break the bars of their yoke and rescue them from the hands of those who enslave them. They will no longer be plundered by the nations, nor will wild animals devour them. They will live in safety. That is a big deal. They will live in safety. They said back in 27, they said that they will be secure in their land. Here it says they will live safely in their land, and no one will make them afraid. I will provide for them a land renowned for its crops, and they will no longer be victims. These are big, tall promises we're talking about. No longer be victims of famine in the land or bear the scorn of the nations. They will know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and that they, the Israelites, are my people, declares the sovereign Lord. You will be my sheep and the sheep of my pasture, and I am your God, declares the sovereign Lord. The overriding theme here is blessing and safety in their own land. It's all about the land with Israel. And I can't blame them with that. They were promised the land by God to Abraham. And they've been through so many iterations of being conquered and taken into captivity. And they're still wandering, except they're now being pushed back to the land by God. Since their return to Jerusalem in 535 BC under Nehemiah, if you recall, they were taken out of Judah into Babylon when they were conquered. They stayed there 70 years under a prophecy by Jeremiah. And then King Darius allowed Nehemiah to leave and take whoever wanted to go back with him back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple. Since their return to Jerusalem in 535 BC, they have not received any of the blessings that are listed here. In fact, until 1948, they did not even have a land to be returned to. They have continually dwelt under the control of 4 world empires. They were conquered under Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians. Then the Babylonians were conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And then the Medes and the Persians were conquered by the Greeks. And then the Greeks were conquered by the Romans. And all those times, they've been under somebody's thumb. And they still don't have a king, if you recall. Then they were really scattered in 70 AD. The Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and everybody just scattered. There was a Christian persecution. The Jews were scattered as well. It has been said that there are more Jews in New York City than anywhere else in the world, and they have not yet been gathered to Jerusalem. We know God is pushing them back right now, but they in no way dwell in the land in safety. They're getting back in the land, but they're not living safely. They've got this iron dome. That's what it's called. It's a missile defense system. People are sending rockets and bombs in there all the time, and every day they're in a fight for existence. That's not what I call dwelling in safety. So something's got to change. These verses are about the time following the second coming of Christ. Zechariah 12 is a prophecy that tells of a time when they are about to be destroyed, when Messiah returns in the midst of it all. In that prophecy, they recognize, I've told you this before, Zechariah 12 was such a wonderful book to study. In that prophecy, it's in Zechariah 12, they recognize the Messiah as being the one that they wounded, as the one they recognize. They see he comes down, puts his feet on the Mount of Olives, and there's a great earthquake. they see the wounds in his hands, and they recognize that he was the one that they crucified. They crucified their Messiah, and they're going to, the Bible says they're going to weep as a father weeps for his only son. And the world also will weep as well, because they're going to realize they had a chance to accept the Messiah and they rejected him. These verses will be fulfilled immediately after the prophecy is fulfilled. Let's go back and look at Zechariah 12. Let me read some of these verses. Zechariah 12. Zechariah 12 verse 9 says this: On that day I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. This is at the end of Armageddon. All the nations are there to fight against Israel. God says, on that day I will destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. Chapter 12 verse 10 says, And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, the one they have crucified, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. Chapter 13, verse 1 of Zechariah. On that day, this is so moving. All of this stuff we're going to see in Ezekiel. That's what's coming. On that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. And then chapter 14, verse 8. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half to the east to the Dead Sea and half to the west to the Mediterranean Sea in summer and in winter. Speaking of that water, you know about Armageddon. You know about the second coming, where Jesus puts his feet down on the Mount of Olives and there's an earthquake. But this, you may not have read about this water flowing out of Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. We're going to see that. We're going to read about this in detail in Ezekiel as we come to it. It's not too far away, but it talks about the water trickling out from under the door sill of the temple, and it trickles down the mountain. It says it flows two different ways here: one to the Dead Sea, one to the Mediterranean. Well, as it trickles down the mountain, it starts as a trickle. As it trickles down the mountain towards the Dead Sea, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. You can wade across it. It gets harder and harder to wade across it eventually. Then you can swim across it. Then it gets even too rapid of a current to even swim across, and it gets into the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is going to become alive. It's going to be teeming with all kinds of fish, the Bible says. And we're going to enter into Eden-like conditions. We're going to study this as the promises of restoration that come, and it's going to be fulfilled in the Messianic age. So, or in the millennium. So, I just want you to know that we serve a God that is so miraculous that his ways are unfathomable. These promises almost seem unbelievable, except we know they are believable. They are our God that we have seen over and over and over again fulfill the things that he says that he will do. We serve a God that is miraculous, that has ways that are unfathomable. He is moved to love his people. He is moved to compassion for his people. And he is moved to live among them forever. All right, that's all I have for you today. I want to thank you for studying with me.